Liam Arquette performed control like breathing, a motion so practiced that when he stepped into a press-filled suite of cameras and carefully angled lights, it looked effortless, like art rather than armor. He walked the carpet as if the world had been rehearsed for him, a choreographed loop of smiles and nods and the perfect tilt of chin, and the flashing lights folded neatly into the script he had written for himself. The penthouse behind him smelled of sandalwood and old leather, a smell that had become his signature, and that everyone around him associated with strength and reliability. And yet, when the curtain fell and his handlers applauded, there was a particular tightness in the base of his throat that not even the scent could conceal. Behind the fame, behind the glossy magazine covers and the curated interviews, there was a routine he guarded like currency. Every 12 hours, he would retreat to a small, windowless bathroom in his building and inject the vial that smoothed the harder edges of his chemistry. A prescribed suppression meant to keep headlines tidy and endorsements safe. Tonight, the label on the vial had been smudged, but he had followed the motion without question for years. The studio had called a week ago, and the funding for the film he had pinioned his image to had been withdrawn, a single polite email that read like a verdict. The project he had promised to save, the character he had promised his fans and himself, evaporated with the economy of a cancelled release. For 2 years, Noah Gray had been Liam's shadow, a fixture at the corner of every shoot, an economy of motion and silence that made the actor look untouchable. Noah had a bodyguard title on the agency roster, but a softer name pinned in the building where he lived, a name that tasted lower profile and safer for the life he had built under a different sky. He was the man who kept Liam dwarfed by safety, who had learned the exact weight of Liam's suit when he left the stage and the right pressure to lay a hand on his elbow when flashbulbs kilted. The ask landed in the quiet between privacy and panic, a sentence that was not part of any contract. "Stay," Liam said one late night, the words unadorned and human and almost embarrassed. "I do not want to be alone." 2 years of ironclad control were a brittle thing, and tonight they promised to splinter into 1,000 small, sharp pieces. The city thrummed, and the smell motif followed them, a trail of sandalwood that clung to coats and spilled into crowded restaurants. The first scene where professional lines blurred began with the wrong music for the wrong crowd, a charity gala that became a pressure cooker when financiers and paparazzi mingled too easily. Noah had expected the usual choreography, a perimeter of polite smiles, a practiced shoulder to steer Liam away from intrusive microphones, a gentle shove to keep cameras at bay. Instead, the event unclipped him, the sponsor who had guaranteed the gala's after-party folding his support like bad paper and leaving the evening suspended on awkward conversations. Noah felt the change in the muscles of his neck before he allowed himself to name it, a soft, hot swell it read as nausea and as something else, an internal tide that had not been part of his life plan. He had been pretending to be weak, to be an Omega who could be sourced and contained, his agency files carefully dyed and his medical history edited to suggest fragility that was a performance meant to shield rather than invite pity. Under his uniform, he wore the belt of a life constructed to hide who he truly was, a life that included gestures of submission when cameras were near and practiced stoicism when the world demanded impenetrability. That night, the control he has cultivated faltered because the body is a truth-teller, and it had started to betray him in a way he could not suppress with a vial and a practiced hand. In the cloakroom after the gala, he pressed his palms into the cool tile, smelling his own skin and the lingering perfume of Liam, and the tactile memory of Liam's shoulder pressed against his palm 6 hours before unfurled into a dangerous wish. They talked then in a back room with a slow collapse into frankness, the dialogue long enough to feel like confession and precise enough to be a decision. Noah said, "I am not what my file says," and Liam answered, "How much of you is a performance?" The exchange lengthened, both men tracing the boundaries of professional distance with words that read like a negotiation and a seduction at once. "You could be safe with me," Liam said, voice low and rough from the press. "Safe is not a costume," Noah replied, fingers splayed on his knee, nails biting into fabric for purchase. "What are you asking me?" Noah asked. And instead of the answer he had rehearsed, Liam laughed, a small private sound, and admitted, "I am asking you to be here without the rules." The balance shifted in increments that were tactile long before they were symbolic. A hand staying a heartbeat longer on a forearm, a palm brushing a back in the pretense of a crowd control move. There were consequences to that night, small in the moment and explosive in time. The exchange had 10 passes of talk, 10 little torches thrown across a dark room, and each pass revealed more. The reasons Liam kept his face perfect, the reasons Noah had constructed a fragile identity, the history of a suppression injection kept as a secret and as an obligation, the memory of a childhood where being loud invited danger, the misbeliefs that led both men to believe safety required performance. They kissed for the first time, with no audience, a brief contact that felt like surrender, and then a debate. Later, when Liam would remember, he would catalog the nothings that had become everything, the first time Noah let him see a twitch at the corner of his mouth that was not meant for press consumption. The night broke rules, and the two of them, professionals of necessity, found themselves wanting a private rulebook written just for them. What followed was immediate and messy. The studio's withdrawal meant a cascade of problems Liam had insulated himself from with fame and money. Endorsements dried up, deals that had waited on his name evaporated, and an investor pulled a line of credit the way a hand closes around a loose thread. Noah's life, tethered to Liam's orbit by duty and paycheck, tensed as logistics began to creak. He arranged an exit plan that was more like a disappearance. He booked 2 tickets under a false name, packed a duffel with clothes he did not expect to care about, and rented a small house in a coastal town called Port Blossom, where no one would recognize the tones of celebrity that seemed to follow like a persistent tide. The first physical symptom arrived on a long drive while Liam slept beside him, head heavy on Noah's shoulder, a morning sickness that announced itself with the intimate betrayal of a hand over a mouth. Noah had known bodies could change, had attended training sessions on stress responses and suppression protocols, had read the clinical sheets in tiny print that accompanied certain injections and hormonal regimens. But the particular type of change that settled into him now was not in the programming. He left a note for his manager that read as a quick, tidy resignation and took a train to the coast, keeping the way he walked measured and small. In a rented room by the sea, he began to hide in plain sight, taking odd jobs at a bookstore owned by a woman named June, who liked to hum while she shelved the new arrivals, and learning the rhythm of a town where fame had not yet discovered a foothold. There was an immediate logistical thread to the hiding, a short list of things to do to avoid detection, the kind of procedural motion a bodyguard is good at. He changed his phone number, visited a local clinic under his alias for an appointment, and carefully documented every step. The medical clerks giving him forms to sign, ultrasounds planned, appointment time slotted, as if time could be contained in boxes. The act of hiding had its own tenderness. Minutes of quiet inventory and cooking, and the small joy of a market that sold sour cherries. He kept a ritual, smelling sandalwood in a small amber vial he had tucked into a drawer, a reminder both of Liam and of steadiness, a link he refused to sever. The discovery phase was inevitable. Back in the city, Liam felt the hollow left by Noah like a missing limb. He hired a private investigator named Harper, who had a reputation for discretion and a willingness to read fandom forums for breadcrumbs. Mason, Liam's manager, argued that a public search was dangerous, that the paparazzi were only patience away from turning a personal absence into a scandal. Rosa, the publicist, drafted a statement about needing time to grieve and recalibrate, wanting to anchor the narrative before rumor could. It was Ethan, the film director, whose film had been canceled, who pushed Liam in a different direction, telling him to follow the thing he had actually loved rather than the cover story. Liam listened to them, and then he listened to his scent memory, the soft incision of sandalwood and old leather that had become an ache. He hired Harper on his own terms and asked to be relentless, not because he wanted headlines, but because he had begun to understand that there were pieces of himself he could not live without. The investigator found a lead within a week, a rent payment under the name Ben Holloway, a bookstore receipt with June's initials scrawled on the bottom. and a picture from a local market that showed a man with a work shirt and a rounded midsection, a silhouette that suggested more than absence. The next phase of the narrative became the hunt, made less by the bustle of tabloids and more by the quiet obsession of someone unaccustomed to losing anything. Liam drove to Port Blossom as if he were going to a funeral. He called Carlos, a friend from early days who now ran a small talent agency branch, and he told him, "I am coming to find what I left behind." And Carlos said, "Then bring gloves." And Liam laughed at the unexpected domesticity of the instruction. The confrontation was not the cinematic burst Liam had rehearsed in his head. It was smaller and truer, a meeting outside June's bookshop on a morning when gulls punctured the sky and the smell of salt and old paper mixed with sandalwood in a way that felt almost like memory made fresh. Noah had been doing inventory, his hands folded in a way that made his belly a quiet fact and not a proclamation. And when Liam stepped into the doorway, the world contracted to the space between them. They traded 10 lines of dialogue that were a map of how far they'd come and how far they had to go. Liam said, "I could not stop thinking about you." And Noah answered, "You left. You are allowed to leave," which was both true and not true. Liam asked, "Did you think I would not follow?" And Noah replied, "I did not know if I wanted you to." The answer carrying a weight that made Liam's voice go small. The conversation unfolded as a negotiation, and then as a confession, with both men revealing the truths that had undercut their defenses. "Where were you sleeping?" Liam asked, and Noah replied, "I rented a room and worked mornings and breathed at night." "Did you tell anyone?" Liam asked, and the truth landed soft and private. Only June and the clinic. There was a moment of silence where the tactile sense of Liam's hand resting on Noah's hair spoke more than any sentence could. They argued with the ferocity of people who had been careful with their hearts, and then spoke with the tenderness of people who had to be careful still. The exchange reached a crescendo when Noah finally let the admission breach his lips. "I am carrying your child," a sentence that made both of them breathe as if for the first time. Liam's face rearranged, the control slipping not into chaos, but into a tenderness that had not had room to exist before. He said, "We are going to have to be honest." And Noah answered, "I have been honest about what matters." And the duet of those two confessions rewrote the terms of their pact. In the background of this intimate confrontation were the secondary characters who shaped the arc. Mason negotiated with Liam's former backers, arguing that Liam could rebuild a brand around fatherhood if he wanted, the idea both radical and marketable. Rosa drafted carefully worded releases that could pivot public perception, placing a protective narrative in front of a vulnerable truth. Harper, the investigator, filed reports that were precise and unemotional, and later he would be the one to find the medical record smudged under an alias and present it to Liam like a fact that could not be unmade. June, the bookstore owner, offered Noah soup and a place to stay when the first waves of nausea made it hard to go on, and she became an anchor in a town that smelled of salt and printed paper. Ethan sent a camera crew to Port Blossom to film a documentary about reinvention, insisting that truth had a market of its own. Mr. Reyes, once a studio investor, reappeared with offers of quiet investment if the narrative could be steered away from scandal. Each of these characters made choices that moved the plot. None of them were mere backdrop. They had names and actions that altered the stakes and the logistics of hiding and seeking. The practicalities of medical care were handled with a procedural clarity that Noah appreciated because he trusted systems the way he trusted the weight of restraints on a crowd. The clinic visit was described precisely in a way that made the reader understand process without clinical dryness. He filled out a new patient form with his alias, his weight and blood pressure were measured, an ultrasound appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the nurse explained prenatal vitamins and recommended a simple blood panel. The description was exact into a span of about 300 characters, and it conveyed the competence of the staff and the small relief of being treated with ordinary care. There were protocols for confidentiality and a short written statement that the clinic would not release records without a court order, language that gave Noah the small comfort of legal protection even as his secret remained risky. The injection he had been taking decades earlier was not detailed as a miracle cure, but explained as a suppression medication that adjusted hormone levels and required careful dosing. A paragraph of about 300 characters that outlined side effects and the need for medical supervision. Those technical notes served as the scaffolding for human drama and gave the narrative credibility without stealing tenderness from the central relationship. Tension swelled in the moments when other people's obligations collided with theirs. A paparazzo named Finch took the market photo that started the rumor mill, posting an image with a caption that smelled of implication and malice. Liam faced a choice of using his platform to control the narrative or to step into vulnerability in public, exposing himself to criticism for choices that felt deeply private. Noah, who had always been schooled in the ways of concealment, found the idea of public parenting terrifying, the potential for exploitation an obvious threat. There were 2 scenes of high tension where they considered running, considered erasing themselves and starting in a town where no one knew the price of Liam's fame. In both moments, the prose lingered on physical sensations, on the taste of salt in the air, on the texture of a coat under an anxious hand, and on the repeated smell of sandalwood that signaled both their tether and the thing they could not fully possess. The climactic confrontation opened like a careful dialogical dance, a blockade of questions and admissions that stretched into a dozen touches, a dozen small movements that mattered more than any grandiose gesture. The scene contained 12 exchanges that were each weighted and tactile, each line followed by a micro-gesture. Liam reached for Noah's hand and did not pull away when Noah's fingers tightened in reflex, a small act that resonated as consent and commitment. Noah confessed the depth of his fear about exposure and the vulnerability of a body that would be scrutinized. And Liam replied with planning and promise. "I will protect our child, and I will protect you," Liam said. And the words were not about headlines, but about nights and doctors and sleeplessness. Noah listened and then asked a question that had haunted him through the flight and the quiet evenings. "How will you handle the cameras?" And Liam answered, "I will learn to be honest, because hiding will break us." There was a scene in which Mason argued for a staged reveal, and Rosa pushed back, wanting the reveal to be authentic. They negotiated terms, releases, and the truth that would be told and the parts that would remain private. The choice they arrived at was messy and deliberate and human. After the confrontation, they built a plan that included legal steps, public statements, and a fragile domestic architecture. Liam reconciled with the idea of fatherhood not as a brand, but as a life. Noah accepted that surrender involved trust and not only the loss of anonymity. They took small steps toward building a home where a baby could be raised away from the relentless spotlight. They moved to a quieter apartment within the city at first, a place that smelt faintly of lacquer and memory, and then to a house near Port Blossom where June's soup made regular appearances. The chapters of reinvention involved mundane work, paperwork, and tender moments that accumulated into a life. They visited prenatal clinics, they argued about names, they sat in the kitchen with the radio turned low and planned meals that would nourish a small body. The motif of sandalwood recurred in Noah's scarf and in a candle Liam bought when he could finally stand being in the same room without flinching. It became a scent associated with the concept of home, rather than with the public shell Liam had worn. Around the 33% mark of the narrative, a space opened for the audience, a call to engage that acknowledged the emotions raised and invited the reader into conversation. If you felt the strange mix of protectiveness and ache in this part of the story, know that you are not alone in that feeling. Did Noah make the right choice by disappearing until he felt ready to tell the truth, or would you have stayed and faced the storm sooner? Start your answer with "I would choose" or "I would stay," and explain why. This is a safe text space to weigh the moral questions of privacy and public life, and your thoughts help shape how future stories will explore the tension between fame and family. Your comments create community and keep conversation honest and kind, and they matter to the narrator just as much as the choices made by Liam and Noah. Now continue the story to learn what happened when the public finally learned and how 2 men rebuilt a life in imperfect but determined ways. The revelation to the world arrived not with the scream of scandal, but with a measured breath and a photograph commissioned intentionally. a picture of Liam holding Noah's hand outside a small clinic, with June offering a shy wave in the background. The image was warm and deliberate and took the headline rooms by surprise, offering a narrative of intention rather than of rumor. Liam gave an interview where he spoke in an almost shy voice about love and responsibility, about the terror and the wonder of impending parenthood, and he allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways that felt like a confession that had migrated to pride. The reaction was predictably mixed. Some tabloids sneered and some fans wept, and the industry recalibrated. Ethan, the director who had not given up, proposed a project that told their story with respect and that offered Noah the chance to help shape the retelling. Harper continued to file quiet reports that became useful when a former investor attempted to leverage their privacy into a negotiation. The stakes shifted from secrecy to negotiation and then to the central pleasure of preparing a life. The epilogue unfolded in 3 times. 1 month later, they were adjusting to nights that were not made for sleeping. Liam had been a man who measured time in call sheets and travel days, but now he measured it in feedings and early morning ultrasounds. The first month was a fog of tenderness and fatigue, and in that fog, Liam learned the gentleness of waking for small things. He stood at dawn in the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes while Noah prepared tea, and they spoke in whispers about names and doctors, smelling the faint sandalwood in a scarf left on a chair. Liam called Mason and Rosa not to manage a crisis, but to thank them for the support they had offered, a small inversion that felt almost holy. They attended medical checkups with practiced professionalism from the staff and with wonder in their voices. And they took pictures in quiet corners that they labeled private, images that would not be shared but that they would return to when they doubted themselves. The community around them rallied in small ways. June left casseroles at the door, Carlos sent a list of contacts for pediatricians and for sleep consultants, and Harper suggested a secure way to handle legal releases. Each gesture was small and focused on concrete help rather than drama. Liam learned to rock with an exhausted tenderness he had never known. 3 months later, they announced a modest public statement that framed their choice as a deliberate step toward family and authenticity. The narrative had shifted enough that Liam's career was reimagined rather than erased. The new project Ethan proposed was greenlit in a scaled form, a film about men learning to father in unexpected circumstances. And sponsors found that authenticity could translate to audience loyalty. Noah had grown more comfortable with being seen, the texture of his life integrating into public awareness without being stripped of dignity. The magazine pieces that followed were kinder, often written by journalists who had been moved by the honesty of Liam's interview. They designed a routine that balanced visits home with quiet days at the bookstore and walks on the beach, where they collected stones to tuck in a tiny keepsake box. The scent motif of sandalwood continued to be a thread, appearing in a crib mobile Liam chose for its subtle fragrance, a domestic choice that turned a symbol of image into a symbol of intimacy. 6 months later, life had settled into a new normal, not perfect but steadier, brimmed with practicalities and hope. They had moved to a home near Port Blossom for long stretches and maintained a small apartment in the city for work. Liam had learned to field questions with brevity and with strength, and to redirect them. Conversation to the real work of parenting. Noah felt confident in his body and his choices, his medical care on schedule, and his health monitored by clinicians who treated him with ordinary care. The baby was a small rumor turned miracle, a quiet human who changed the axis of both men in simple ways. Liam returned to work with a smaller schedule and a willingness to turn down projects that asked him to perform rather than to be. And Noah took on a role managing the household and public privacy with the same competence he had applied to crowd control. They built a life that had concrete markers of change. A pediatrician named Dr. Hugh whom they trusted, a routine of evening baths and low music, a shelf in June's bookstore with a small photo in a frame. They made choices about school and about stories they would tell their child that had nothing to do with fame. The final paragraphs echoed the sensory motif the narrative had kept as tether. The smell that had once been a professional signature of sandalwood and old leather had softened into the scent of a home with a baby, a scent of laundry, of lemon soap, of a candle lit sometimes in the evenings when they allowed themselves to remember how fragile and how human they had been. Protection had shifted from duty to devotion and from a public posture to a private sanctity. The concluding lines invited reflection and connection, suggesting that no life of fame could completely shield a heart, and that it was in surrender and in trust that they had discovered a version of sanctity intimate and real. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts below and join the community that discusses parenthood, fame, and the quiet bravery of starting over.